Looks good. Okay, so hello everyone. Really glad to see a lot of people here attending this week's FINE seminar. My name is Lauren Hayes. It's been a while since I've hosted, so I'm a professor at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, and I'm one of the co-organizers. And it's my pleasure today to host the FINE seminar of Filippo Aureli. A couple of notes before we get started. So for those of you who are new, and the format of this, well, about a 45-minute seminar followed by about an hour of discussion. And we encourage everyone to ask questions, especially students. We'd love to hear from students asking questions. Relay those to the speaker from those of you who watch YouTube today. When you ask a question, please just identify yourself because we'd like to build a community here. Last week, I want to thank Eduardo and all for running a workshop on statistical issues, which is fascinating. And just to let you know, next week, I'm going to share my screen just for a second here. Cover 2 issues. Everyone see that okay? The FINE seminars. Next week, we have Michael Ryan, who's going to be talking about mate choice. So we're looking forward to that. And hope people can attend that. So I'm going to jump right into today's seminar. Today, I'm really pleased to introduce Filippo Aureli. Filippo's been a really active participant in FINE, so it's been a pleasure to get to know him. I had read some of his stuff, of course, but I think the first time we met was during the pandemic, so really happy to have him presenting today. So just a note about next weekend, by the way. Thank you, Marin, for doing this before I forget. Next weekend, Europe moves the time. So please pay attention to the FINE announcement about next week. It will indicate a different Paris time. The United States is a week later, I believe. Excuse me. Okay, so today's speaker, Filippo, fascinating CV here. Filippo did his undergraduate, for those who were here, probably realize he's from Roma. He did his undergrad at Universidad de Roma, and he's traveled a lot since then. He did his PhD in Holland at the University of Utrecht, and then did a postdoc right down the road from where I live now in Atlanta. He was at Emory University, and then did another postdoc, I believe, at University of Liverpool and John Moores. And I learned that despite being there, he likes Man City. So we had a football conversation before this. And now he's at the Universidad of Veracruz in Mexico, I believe at the Universitito de Neuroetologia. And Filippo's research has been fascinating. He, dives into understanding things like regulation of social relations, management of conflict, mechanisms of stress reduction, and he's even now moving into more conservation type questions. And a lot of this work has been done with spider monkeys and other primates, and I'm sure he'll tell you much more about that. His work has involved a lot of collaborations internationally at Max Planck, University of Tokyo, Calgary, Texas, and in Liverpool. And he's trained a large number of students, more than 30 graduate students and postdocs over his career. His publication record is really prolific, more than 150 publications in good journals, ranging from the Proc B, PNAS, biology letters, lots of the behavior journals, primate journals, well published, lots of book chapters, and a couple of books on conflict resolution and primate behavior. And what I was really impressed by was how well people read and cite his work. Google Scholar, I think it was over 16,000 citations, quite impressive career. Lots of awards. I won't go through all of them, but one of the ones that stuck out to me was that he was a top referee for proceedings of Royal Society B, indicating that his service record is quite impressive as well. And his funding comes from various organizations, including National Geographic, the Leakey Foundation, and what I can only guess is probably local Mexican government, federal government funding sources, which is impressive. And with that, I will stop talking and I'll just introduce his seminar title. Today he'll be talking. The title of the seminar is Challenges and Opportunity of Fission-Fusion Dynamics. And with that, I will turn it over to Filippo, and I look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you all for the invitation here, and thanks for all of you being here attending. Well, I'm going to tell you something about fission-fusion dynamics, and I want to start by going a step backward to last week and talking about a little bit about this false dichotomy. In the last seminar, there was many topics, but the most important one we focused on was this kind of false dichotomy of significant result and not significant result based on a p-value of 0.05. Now, without I get more into the details, I want to mention this because today we are going to see also a false dichotomy. We start with that, and in a way, was not the reason why I started to work on fission-fusion dynamics, but it was a reason why I started to do a lot more work on fission-fusion dynamics. There is basically this false dichotomy of seeing groups on animals living in cohesive groups or in fission-fusion societies. So the idea of these fission-fusion societies came from Hans Kummer, that in the 70s, studying Hamadryas, baboons, and geladas, figured out that they were actually having a different type of social organization compared to those that at that time were the most commonly studied, the other type of baboons, the macaques. And so he figured that there was a kind of a basic unit formed by one male with several adult females and the offspring, so one male unit. They were always together, but those units were getting together among themselves, among some of those units, forming a large organization that was a band, and then several bands were getting together to forming a clan, a bigger strategy. Actually, I probably got mixed up with the clan and band. So one male unit forming the clan, and then several clans forming the band. And the band could be pretty big groups. And so you could see there were fissioning of this band in these clans, and then fissioning the clans into the one male unit, and then again the fusing. And the interesting thing is that this one male unit were always the same membership. Then they were always getting together with the same one male units and the same forming the clan, and then the same clans were getting together to form the bands. So there was a lot of flexibility because of fissioning the smaller ants, but also the membership was a little more rigid than what you expect of what the other species that was known to form subgroups at the moment. They were chimpanzees, where the formation of subgroups were much more at the individual base. Every individual could be more or less with anybody else forming subgroups. So this idea of the temporary formation of subgroups gave Hans Kummer the idea that there was something different from the cohesive groups, and he called those the fission-fusion society. Actually, he called them fusion-fission societies, but these terms didn't last very long. They became very quickly fission-fusion societies. Now, several years later, I got fascinated about the topic of fission-fusion in general, and I organized a symposium on fission-fusion society in 2004 at an international meeting, and that was followed up by inviting the majority of all the speakers of the symposium, plus others, to a workshop where we were supposed to discuss about fission-fusion societies, and what we end up to do is really focusing on this false dichotomy and basically reviewing the literature, talking with experts of many different species, not only primates. We had also experts of carnivores and cetaceans that were having name fission-fusion societies, seeing that there's actually much more variation in this subgroup formation, and that the term of fission-fusion society, as in contrast with cohesive groups, was not really appropriate. And so we suggested this term Fission-fusion dynamics in a paper that came out several years later in 2008. And so the idea here is that there is a degree of Fission-fusion dynamics is a characteristic of any social system. So it's not anymore one particular type of groups, the Fission-fusion societies, but actually is something that can be present in any species with different degrees. So the one that don't show up any Fission-fusion dynamics will have a degree 0 of that. And so the idea was to move away from this dichotomy, but now I give you a little update. This paper was published in 2008, but I must say that Fission-fusion societies, the term Fission-fusion is still used. And it's interesting because it's 14 years later, and we are so ingrained with this. Many of us, not a younger generation, grew up with these terms because until 2008 was in use, that we make these mistakes. So I may actually slip in and say Fission-fusion society. Last week, when Eduardo mentioned that I was going to talk, he mentioned that I was going to talk about Fission-fusion societies, for instance. Several of the co-authors of the 2008 article actually published using the term Fission-fusion societies. And our 2008 article is cited as a reference for Fission-fusion society. So people will write by saying, okay, this species live in Fission-fusion society, open parenthesis, Aureli et al. 2008. Basically, in that paper, we say actually the opposite. Some of my colleagues say, okay, doesn't matter if they cite you correctly or not, it's important to be cited. I cannot disagree, especially for a paper like this that helps a lot of my citation. Citation that was mentioned by Lauren is cited almost 1,000 times. So it's something I never thought, and I'm sure none of the co-authors ever thought that was going to be a paper going to cite it and mis-cited so many times. So do we have to realize that changes are slow? And I accept that, so I don't want that everything is changing right away, but I want to convince that the idea behind this change is an important one, and also that it's important, it's interesting to study Fission-fusion dynamics. So this idea of the degree of Fission-fusion dynamics that being a characteristic of any social system is not completely new. In a kind of landmark article that Peter Kaples and Karl van Schaik published in 2002, when they review basically what are the components of the social systems, for social organization, they identify degree of spatial temporal cohesion as a component of social organization. Now, it's not exactly the same, but clearly focus on the cohesion, and clearly the cohesion between individuals within a group is a key element in the concept of Fission-fusion dynamics. The spatial cohesion is obvious. The temporal cohesion is the key. So there is a temporal variation in this cohesion, and that is something that we focus on, the idea of the degree of Fission-fusion dynamics. In fact, we could identify 3 components of Fission-fusion dynamics, and one of them is basically getting very much on the spatial cohesion, on the element that was identified by Kaplan and van Schaik, temporal variation in spatial cohesion in among group members. And that's so it's possible for any group living animals, and in a way we could push it to also solitary animals, and then we get how that actually could apply. But basically is how variable is their cohesion. So they are always in a very cohesive group, or they are always in a very dispersed way. Then they are, for this measure, they are kind of the same. So basically the variation, the temporal variation is very little. So it's not the cohesion per se, the degree of cohesion is the degree of temporal variation in spatial cohesion. And the other 2 components instead are very much linked to subgroup formation. So they need to form subgroups, and then it's the temporal variation in subgroup size and the temporal variation in subgroup composition. So with these 3 components, we could actually suggest a Fission-fusion space with the 3 elements here. We can have on this axis the variation in spatial cohesion. We mean the temporal variation in spatial cohesion. Here we have the temporal variation in party size, and here we have the variation, the temporal variation in party composition. And so when they all are very low, like here, they are low in all three, then we could have a species like marmosets, that they are in small, in very cohesive groups. They move all together all the time. Okay. Now, important to say that there will be also low fission-fusion dynamics if the group is always very dispersed and the move always very dispersed. So it's a temporal variation that is the key. They don't form subgroups, so we don't have variation in party composition and party size. Sorry for this slide, there's the word party, but party and subgroups in the fission-fusion literature are actually the same. And so we can read party as a subgroup, and I will use most of the time during the talk the word subgroup. And but anyway, so a group that has basically doesn't form subgroups has low variation both in party size and party composition, of course, but also if it stays always the same dispersion, so the same high degree of dispersion will be still very low in the variation, in temporal variation in spatial cohesion. Now, if we want to have other example, we want to have somebody that is maybe has a high variation in spatial cohesion, high variation in party size, but maybe not so much in party composition. These are the species that Hans Kummer was studying. So the amadrized baboons are kind of here in the middle because they change quite a bit in party size from the one male unit to the clan, the band, and then the bands also get into a larger structure, a larger level of organization. And so there is a lot, but the party composition is relatively fixed because they are based on those units they cannot get together in a particular, in a kind of systematic way. And so the one that is as high in all of the components, so they will be on this particular axis, we could think about dolphins. And now, of course, some of the cetaceous experts that are in the audience may think about maybe not the dolphins, maybe somebody else, but or the chimpanzees that by the time that Hans Kummer was putting together was the species that people were thinking that would have been there. And I will, since most of my talk will be on spider monkeys are there as well. I tell you just now. Okay, so we could place all, and then it's interesting on this page we could place all the different species. Of course, we need to have ways to quantify the degree of this variation, temporal variation in these three components. So when we have a degree of a high degree of fission-fusion dynamics, so we move from the degree, now we focus on what are the characteristics of having high degree of fission-fusion dynamics, is that group members are really all together, and they frequently fission and fuse in subgroups of variable size and composition. Now, I think probably I'm talking to an audience that can visualize rather well this situation, but I often give talks to a more general public on these issues or in an interdisciplinary forum. So I have a good example to visualize that. And ourselves, human beings is one of those species. And if you think about a small village, you can think about everybody know one another, but very rarely all together. They are all together. Maybe only for the kind of the festivity of the village itself, or for a special occasion. But they live a life in subgroups. And then we move to our own life. Although most of us don't live in village, what we do is exactly a life of fission-fusion. We start from our home, where we spend the night in a particular subgroup. We go to work or to study in a different subgroup. We go maybe having a coffee break with a portion of this individual with whom we have before, or maybe with others, another subgroup. Then we take a different class, a different subgroup. Then we go for lunch with different individuals, different subgroups, and so on and so forth during the course of the day. So our life is a good example of a high degrees of fission-fusion dynamics. What implies is that there is variation in opportunity for group members to interact with one another, because they're not always together. And there is a variation in subgroup composition. That means that there is a variation in the extent to which the social environment changes. The social environment meaning the rest of the individuals that are around you. Those two last points have been for many years seen as methodological problems. if you are a researcher that study cohesive groups, or a researcher that study the fission-fusion societies, but want to apply the methods that usually are used in animals that live in cohesive groups, is a problem to study a species in which the animals are not always together. So you have to control for the opportunities for interacting with individuals. If you want to come up with rates of interaction, you need to control who is present in that particular situation. And if you want to study anything that has to be related to audience effect or how other individuals may play a role in what the individuals interact and so on, then there's another challenge that the individuals are not always the same. They're not always all the other group members, but they are changing depending on the several composition. So there are methodological problems, and fission-fusion dynamics have been seen as problems, basically methodological problem that had a major impact in the production of studies on fission-fusion dynamics. Now, a few years ago, I did a kind of a literature research using the term fission-fusion, using Web of Science, and using focusing on only relevant articles, so removing all the one on physics and cell biology, which the terms fission-fusion means something different. And here are the publication per year that I found. On the y-axis are the frequencies, so the number of actually articles, and on the x-axis the years. And you can see there's sometimes since the publication of the term fission-fusion in 1971, there's a publication in 1975. A bet is a paper by Hans Kummer. Then there's a one in 1982, one in 97, and then four again here, but very, very little overall. Then we organized in 2004 this symposium. This was not only, it was based on a kind of a general interest. So that in the literature, this looked like there was a growing interest in this topic. We organized this symposium, we organized a workshop, we published the paper, and basically we focusing in telling that basically this variation in opportunities, variation in subgroup composition actually makes interesting research topics. And what happens is, bang, we get many more publications overall. That this ended in 2015, but I can tell you that only by looking at the number of citations of our fission-fusion dynamics 2008 paper, they are basically around 80 citation every single year. So there is clearly an incredible change in the use of fission-fusion terminology. That so it could have been society or dynamics or whatever you want to, but the term fission-fusion has been start to be used much more often. And so this opportunity for group members to interact with one another and the extent to which the social environment changes that are linked to fission-fusion dynamics, the fission-fusion dynamic plays a role in these two components. It plays a role as modulators of social interactions, and as the title of my presentation the hint, they create challenges and opportunity for the animals that live in groups with high degree of fission-fusion dynamics. And I'm going to focus on those, and to do that, I'm going to focus on example on the spider monkeys. That is the species that, after having studied several species of macaques and chimpanzees, I shift to study them in 2020 myself. And I've been studying them in the two long-term field project where individually identified monkeys have been. This is a project that a colleague of mine, Gabriel Ramos-Fernández, already started in 1997, and then I joined, and then the one that I started in 2000, and then by the 2003 we were able. So one is in a small location called near the village of Punta Laguna in the Otosh Mahasi Ko, that in Maya means the house of the monkey and the puma, and in Costa Rica instead in a national Santa Rosa National Park. And these are the two longest projects on any spider monkey species with continuous data on individual identified monkeys. And all the work that I'm presenting today could not have been possible without my long-term collaborators at the two field site, and without many student postdocs and field assistant. The local field assistant are portrayed here. They have at least as many years I have of experience with studies spider monkeys, and some of them even longer because they started already in 1997. So we are blessed by having really some incredibly motivated and dedicated people helping us in this project. And studying spider monkeys is a bit challenging. We are lucky that compared to the people that study them in South America, the forests where we study are rather low, so the spider monkey cannot go higher than 25 meters because the canopy is around that high, but it's still challenging. They can run very quickly. Now, talking about the challenges, methodological challenges, if we want to study a species that form subgroups and we are interested in the fission-fusion dynamic, we need to define subgroups. And here is a sharp contrast with what was happening before. Most of the research done when the fission-fusion was a problem was basically the definition of subgroup is very, let's say, not very systematic, let's put it that way. Basically, one extreme can get to the point that there are the animals that by following, while the researcher was following one individual, where the other animals that had been seen during an hour. So this individual could have been in one subgroup for half an hour, and another completely different subgroup in another half an hour, but still the subgroup composition would have been all individuals. So the two subgroups together, they never happened. Okay, so they were rather sloppy type of definition. I don't say all of them, but there are some that are really showing that the focus was not the research of fission-fusion dynamics, was somehow quickly to try to correct for the probability, for the opportunity to interact with one another. Here instead, what we did when we started, we thought, okay, no, we need to do it in a very systematic way. And so what we did was to try to identify basically the interindividual distance between all group members, not subgroup member, group members. This is a daunting task if you don't have GPS on every single individual. Probably you have seen there are some data coming out of different species that act very nicely and are envying them completely. That can be done. We have done the GPS was in our hands. We were going under each single monkey of the subgroup we were following, getting a GPS point, and then when the subgroup was in a stationary situation, so they were resting or they were foraging for a extended period of time, we were walking 30 meters away and we were doing a circle with a 30 meters radium, and then another one with a 70 meters radium, and that will give us be able to see animals about 30 meters from our position. So gave us a coverage an area of about 200 meters diameter. So the larger distance between two animals there could have been 200 meters. We were sure that we were missing some individuals, but it was not as essential for this purpose. So what we did then, plotting this interindividual distance, and we were having basically try to get yes, the frequency depending of that, and we can see that this one here are the one that are short distance at the individual that are in the same subgroup. Then you will expect that there are some individuals that are in between subgroups and just moving, fissioning or fusing, and then there will be up here another big distribution of the individuals that were in different subgroups. We don't get those because we didn't do, for this particular analysis, the simultaneous follow different subgroups to get this information, but also because it was not needed. What we needed is to get when this was dropping, what we could find when identify when the individual were actually in the fissioning or in the fusing situation. And what we found here is that basically we found that that point here is the one for this specific case, the critical measure. And so we then apply what is being used before us for cetaceous studies, the chain rule, to decide which individuals are in the same part, in the same subgroup. This is very nicely presented in Crawford et al. Book, and is for any single animals. And then my colleague Gabriel Ramos-Fernández applied for the first time in spider monkeys. Now I try to explain what it is. Basically, the chain rule suggests that the distance that we get there, let's say there is 30 meters, is basically the distance that an individual needs to be the distance that between the individual we want to and any subgroup member to have considered that individual in the same subgroup. So here is an example. If we apply the rule of less than 30 meters, we have this distribution. We could think about we have potentially 3 subgroups, one down here, one here in the middle by itself, and the one here. Now, if I put some distance, individual distance, we can say clearly that this individual and this individual don't belong to the same group. So this is a separate individual subgroup. But here with a distance of 40 meters between this and this individual could be a different subgroup. But here we have the chain rule. This individual is closer than 30 meters from this individual. This is closer than 30 meters from this individual. This is closer than 30 meters. So the key is that is the distance between these two individuals. Because this individual could be in the same subgroup of this one if the distance between this individual is less than 30 meters. In this particular example is 20 meters, so we have 2 subgroups. So even if individuals are very far away from this and this probably are the 70 meters, these are belonging to the same subgroup because of the chain rule. That's actually nothing different than what we do within a group. So a group, we consider a group because of all individuals that are close to other individuals through a kind of a chain rule. So it's nothing new, it's more like the distinction between subgroups, the new part. So in this case, individuals that are far away from more than 30 meters from any subgroup members, they are considered being another subgroup. Well, we have the definition of subgroup. And so we are going to go back to the idea that Hans Kummer had. There was a great idea. We only now criticize the terminology, but the terminology was working very well at that time with the knowledge of that time. It was more like we revised based on the knowledge that was accumulated since the 1970s. But he justified the temporary formation of subgroups as an adjustment of group size to local resource availability. So the formation of subgroups was to reduce to adjust the group size or subgroup size to local resource availability. And why that? Because fission then can reduce competition by adjusting subgroup size to local food availability. This is, I think, is a great idea. It's very likely the explanation for the fission-fusion dynamics. But there's also an opportunity for the individual. So since we're going to talk about opportunity and challenges, this is an opportunity for individuals that live in this type of system to be able to reduce competition. And here's an example. We have a subgroup of spider monkeys, and we have some food resource. If the resource is sufficient for all of them, then no problem, they go and eat. But if it's not, they can actually fission, and anybody can have as much as they want, as much as they need, let's put it that way. Now, this is a simple idea, but it had never been tested. So we ended up to go and test it because we are interested in fission-fusion dynamics. And so we wanted to see if these important premises of the idea that Hans Kummer put actually is supported by the data. And so we used the strong seasonality that our field site in Costa Rica experience with a lot of food during the wet season and much less food during the dry season. And so what we expect if we're looking at the aggression rates is that there is, by looking at contest competition, that we expect that when there is less food available, there should be more aggression than when there is more food available. But we don't find a difference. And we don't find a difference because of what Hans Kummer mentioned. There is a change in subgroup size, and during the dry season, subgroup size is about half of the size of during the wet season. So the reduction in subgroup size when there's less food available creates a situation in which fission can reduce actually contest competition. And I say contest competition because we measure it through aggression. But there is another form of competition, scramble competition, for instance. Scramble competition is a competition in which individuals are forced to share the available resource with one another. And so usually it's a function of group size. And one of the typical measure is the ranging cost. So the same size, the individual living in the same size of group, they will have to travel more when the resources are less common. And so here it was pointed out very nicely by Chapman and co-authors by saying that respect the individuals to fission into smaller subgroup when the access to resources will require longer travel distances. And here is what we tested during in this particular study. And we have the idea is that when there is a certain subgroup size and there is this amount of food availability, you expect that the subgroup will travel and get these resources with a particular ranging cost. If there is less food available, the same size of the individual in the same subgroup the same size of subgroup size, they need to travel much more to get enough resources, and so there is a travel cost. But what the spider monkeys do, they reduce subgroups, and there is no difference in cost. So by fissioning, they reduce scramble competition. And as I emphasize at the food patch level, because of course scramble competition that is at the home range level actually is there as well, because there's a limited number of resources, a certain number of animals in the home range. So if somebody eats one resource, the other will not be able. So at the level of the scramble competition, there is, sorry, at the level of the home range, there is scramble competition. And if we have time, or maybe in the question, we can go over ways that spider monkeys deal with that. Now, one other issues apart from competition is that there could be conflict over decision. This was a topic that we did not cover in our 2008 paper about fission. So we actually wrote, after another workshop, we wrote another paper on collective decision making and Fission-fusion dynamics. This is the idea that when focusing on group that are highly cohesive, there is conflict of interest between individuals to decide where to go or what activity to do, and this process has as consequence of what is happening. But what we figure out in this paper is that the role of Fission-fusion dynamics on collective decision making is crucial but largely overlooked. So we done very recently a study by looking if it actually fissioning has any implication on that. And so the idea is that if you have a group of certain size, but certain individuals want to stay and rest, other individuals want to go and forage, or some individuals want to forage in one food item, and others forage on a different food item. They can simply split. So they don't need to have this process of decision making and coming up with a collective decision. It could be a collective, but at the subgroup level. So there are individuals that want to do the same thing. They can be together. And when we tested this with the very recent paper, it was published this year, by looking at on the y-axis, we have the fission in hourly rate, and here we have the activities dividing synchronized and non-synchronized in a bit arbitrary way, but work. So it's a kind of a conservative way. It could have been not working out, but the activities that we consider an activity is synchronized if the 75% of the individuals in a subgroup have did the same thing, and non-synchronized if there were less than 75% of the individuals doing the same activity. And what we found that is the probability, so actually the rate of fission is twice as high when the individuals were not having not synchronized activities, so suggesting that they were conflict of interest in what to do, and they were actually fissioning. So here as well, fission reduced conflict over decision. So overall, we can say that fission reduced conflict over decision and resource competition. And so the individuals, at least the spider monkeys that we study, seems to take this opportunity very well into account. Now, we are talking about fission-fusion dynamics. So if fission reduce, we could imagine that fusion does something the opposite. So we could have that fusion may create conflict with possible aggressive escalation. And then it's clearly a challenge. So we study that, and we look if there is post-fusion aggression. What you mean is that when the two subgroups come, there may be troubles. Let's see if it's true. we did that in this particular paper, focused on aggression and conflict management at fusion in spider monkeys. And we look at the post-fusion aggression. And here we found that in the 5 minutes post-fusion, the aggression rate is much higher than a baseline. Now, I didn't show you in the slides of the, I didn't focus on the y-axis on the amount of aggression in general in spider monkey is very low, and so this baseline really reflects what usually is. It is pretty low, but after a fusion, it's getting much higher. Now, it could be simply that there's a probability you have two subgroups, then they get together. There are more individuals. There's more aggression for that. So we need to double check. One way to check is that is randomly, so anybody aggress more anybody else, or there is some patterning depending on the membership. So the individuals that were already together and the individual we just joined, and it's pretty clear that it depends on who is doing it. So are the individuals that join from different subgroups the one that experience higher rates of aggression post-fusion? Okay, so the challenge is there. And it seems puzzling that if fission has all these benefits in reducing probability for aggression and conflict, then you get that fusion, there's an increased aggression. So my background in conflict management made me think about there should be some post-fusion conflict management, or at least we need to try to see if there is. And was not easy to think about because it's interesting. Most of my research was done what happens after an aggression, how animals deal with the concept of aggression. Here we have to see that some behavior that it prevents the aggression, but likely it's not just the aggression per se, it's aggression after fusion. So we have the potential sequence, fusion, some conflict management behavior, and then will aggression occur or not after that. And so I could look at post-fusion something, but post-fusion can also be told about meeting again. And so the idea was, let's go back again to think about the village and the humans and what we do. When we meet, we greet. So maybe one behavior that spider monkeys use is a behavior that they use when they approach one another, an embrace. These are very quick contact, face-to-face, and they put their arms around one another, and they put usually the face either on the pectoral gland that they have here or on the armpit of the other individual. And we find that in the 5 minutes post-fusion, the proportion of approaches followed by an embrace are much higher than a baseline. So suggesting that although after an approach, sometimes they embrace, at fusion, they do much more, probably for a very good reason. And the reason that we need to say is, does having the embrace after a fusion have anything to do with the post-fusion aggression? And the answer is yes. After an embrace takes place, there's almost no aggression, while if there's no embrace, there is quite a high level of aggression. So we can conclude that embrace reduce post-fusion aggression, and because of that, fission can be used to reduce conflict because there are mechanisms to deal with post-fusion aggression. They don't occur all the time. We found the post-fusion aggression occurring, but the aggression occurs all the time. It's a normal thing in life for any animal. The interesting thing is there are mechanisms, and so the interesting thing will be to see when these mechanisms are going to be used and when aggression is that takes place. But there is a full package. The fission-fusion deals with aggression and competition. So there are challenges and there are opportunities there. Now, one possible interpretation of these results is also about the possible origin of human greedies. I'm not going to touch, I'll leave it for questions and maybe afterwards. I want to move on some other opportunity challenges. The first one is that we look at the influence, the fission-fusion dynamic clearly influence the opportunity to interact with partners. And this will be basically focused on two aspects. One is decisions about interaction are affected by partner availability. So I cannot interact with one individual if the others are not available. And the uncertainty about how to interact with the same partner depending who else is present. Now, this could be that I have a okay relation with Lauren, but Lauren has a much better relation with Eduardo. So if I'm only with Lauren, I interact in a particular way. But if Eduardo is present, I probably will interact in a different way. Let's put it that way. So, and because of this subgroup composition changing, there is uncertainty there. And that's, I think, could be challenging. And we are going to focus a little bit on that component. The social uncertainty depending on temporal variation in subgroup composition. We did very nicely, again, after a workshop, and then with Gabriel Ramos-Fernández taking the lead on these studies, we basically try to quantify the social uncertainty using information entropy as a measure of the extent to which subgroup composition is predictable. We use the Shannon's entropy to quantify it. We calculate the expected entropy as the maximum unpredictability. We use then a Jensen-Shannon distance to compare observed entropy with expected entropy. And we get something like this. So, and we translated the JS distance that goes from low values to high values to a measure of uncertainty. So when the JS distance is higher, there's lower uncertainty. Okay. And here we have the three species in which we study. We have the spider monkey data. We collaborate with people having chimpanzees data and with gelada data. And the reason to study those species and not others is because these are known to form subgroups that was clearly needed for our research here, for the question, because we are looking at subgroup composition. And so geladas are like Hamadryas baboons, forming this one male unit that Hans Kummer was studying. And so what we expect that the uncertainty should be lower in geladas than in chimpanzees and spider monkey, where the individuals can shuffle in the way that they want. And so the subgroup composition is much more regular in geladas, and that's what we find. There is a lower level of uncertainty in geladas than in chimpanzees and spider monkey. So we find good evidence, but I want to point out in this graph also that there is intraspecific variation. This group of spider monkeys is a bit different from this. No, sorry, pardon. This is the same group at different time. So there is a variation within the spider monkeys data. And that will be, using this measure, we can actually quantify it and then investigate why there are this variation. But for the purpose of this talk, probably is more interesting the next step, that is looking at the inter-individual variation. Now we have data only about spider monkeys, and here we have all the individuals that were present, all the adult individuals present in the group, and here we have the J distance. Let's remember that high value means low uncertainty. So the individuals that are low here in this graph are the one experiencing higher uncertainty. And the square are the males, the circles are the females, and you see there's not much overall difference. There seems to be quite a bit of overlap. The females vary quite a bit compared to the males are much more kind of the same. But the four individuals, I want to focus on four individuals. They are the four individuals that are the lower values, so the one that experience more uncertainty. And interesting enough, these are the only four more recent immigrant females. So as a new member of a group, it's probably understandable that there is more uncertainty to do with the social situation that is shuffled continuously because subgroup composition changes. So again, another indicator, another interesting measure that we can actually associate to what are the characteristics that makes the variation in uncertainty for the different group members. So we focus with the uncertainty about interacting depending on the variation in subgroup composition. And we can say, yes, we find that there is variation, and then we can say, okay, is demand in this part? There is some challenges associated with that, how the animal deal with this uncertainty. Here, want to spend a moment on this article we wrote a few years ago on social complexity, and there is a component on the social organization that we talked about in this article that deals basically with the fission-fusion dynamics, and this is the article that Clark Jones mentioned early on. And the interesting, when we talk about social complexity, we imagine something like this. We imagine a kind of a network of individuals with a lot of different social interactions. Here we have a different type of individuals with circles and square, different colors, and some different characteristics of the individuals. And the scientists from outside see this, and basically this complexity emerge from the interaction between group members. This is a typical way we actually looking at social complexity. Okay, but what we focus on that article, and I want to stress it also today, that there is another level of complexity. It is the complexity experienced by each group member. For instance, is this very spider monkey member, how, from that point of view, looks. And it seems that we say, okay, but it's complex, of course. And then to think more about that, I'm making a strong contrast, species contrast. If we want to contrast the view from outside, from within, let's think about a eusocial bee. The eusocial bee societies is one of the best examples of very complex societies, high social complexity, okay? But what about the complexity experienced by each group member? If we focus on the single spider monkey, on the single bee, I think that's probably very different. So although the single bee lives in very complex society, the complexity that the individual experiences is very little, because the rules they have to follow are very simple. There are 4 or 5 castes maximum, and all the individuals in the same caste are treated in the same way, and so the rules are not that many. They need to treat different individuals, different castes in different ways, and that's it. The spider monkeys and so many other individuals, instead, they have individualized relationship. They have a relation that is different from each single other group members. And so with each single group other members. And then you need to process this information. They need to deal with the interaction of other individuals in the group, how they affect their own interacting, like the example I gave early on, me interacting with Lauren in the presence and absence of Eduardo, for instance. And so there's a lot more going on. Now, of course, is a completely different talk, focusing on individual relationship, and there are several people in the audience, they are experts in this topic, and they wrote nicely. But I think that's important to keep in mind that what we often want to study when we're looking about the demanding. I mentioned because I say, is this uncertainty demanding? The question of demanding is demanding for an individual. But if we're looking then at social complexity as the emerging property, we are not really using the right measure, the right metrics to compare. And so there's a lot of studies, a lot of research that works on brain size, for instance. They tend to use then measures of a complexity. They are not at the individual level, but they are on the emerging property, and probably is not the way that is appropriate. All right, now from social complexity to move to communicative complexity, and this is a paper we wrote recently, linking basically again elements of social structure, mainly on social interaction and social relationship, and organization, mainly fission-fusion dynamics, to the potential of variation in community complexity. And here I want to focus only one aspect that is related very much on fission-fusion dynamics, is that the degree of uncertainty, again, leads potentially to a different number of signals and a different complexity of signals, or the complexity being seen also how certain signals are used in more than one context, for instance, or in different contexts, depending on the level of the degree of uncertainty. And here for illustrating that, we go back to the 2008 paper, because a subgroup of the co-authors focused very much on this aspect of the communication and found very interesting results, very interesting ideas. They put forward very interesting framework that is represented in this illustration. Here we have to think that we have some elements that relate to what I was talking about: least differentiated relationship and most differentiated relationship. This is a y-axis. But on the x-axis, there is the cohesiveness axis, that is least cohesive and most cohesive. This is different from the fission-fusion dynamics cohesive, because there we focus on temporal variation, here just on the actual level of cohesiveness. But in the least cohesiveness, I think there is room for the fission-fusion dynamics as well, and that's why I want to focus on. So in this illustration, they identify also where spider monkeys should be in these 4 quadrants that are identified by these 2 axes. And the challenge they may have, they have to develop signals about differentiated relationships, but also signal to resolve relationship uncertainty due to low cohesiveness. And those are basically when they come back together. So, and as we saw that embrace reduced uncertainty in the context of post-fusion. We also have other data suggesting that that is the case for when females approach other females to have young babies to actually do infant handling. They embrace one another, signaling benign intent in the action. And then in males also, in males the dynamic is very much age related, with the older adult males don't necessarily welcoming the new males in the cohort, the young adult males, and sometimes there are collision attacks that leads to the death of one of the males. And so for the younger male, it's very important to, when approaching the adult males to whom they are very attracted, to signal very clearly their intention. And then again, the initiative in embrace is a much higher taken by younger males approaching older males than by older males approaching younger males. So embrace can play that role. And so here, very briefly, I can say yes. We can see that spider monkeys have also signaled that are used in certain contexts, but they are also devoted for signaling to resolve the relationship uncertainty. So this uncertainty we focus on at the beginning as a potential element of complexity that communication could actually deal with that. And I want to finish with briefly with some cognition. And Lauren, I still have 5 minutes. Yeah, okay, perfect. So I'm going to tell you a few things on cognitive complexity based on what we saw so far. So there is it's very much summarized in these 2 articles. Also, the source for this is actually there are a different article that I will mention in a moment. So one possibility, looking at the scenario of fission-fusion dynamic influence the opportunity to interact with partners, we can say clearly focus on the prolonged absence. So 2 individuals may not be interactive over for prolonged time. So what happens when they meet again? And so what we have that is, there could be that there is an increase in time during past interaction retain the influence on the attitude towards a partner. Now, this sentence is based on the social relationship concept by Robert Hind, in which basically social relationships are basically the sum of all the previous interaction, and the sum is in a very poor way, but it's basically the history of previous interaction makes the social relationship between individuals. And so if the interaction are different between any pairs of individuals, that's why we get into individualized social relationships. So there is a memory attached to that. So if there are prolonged absence, there should be an increased time during this, which past interaction retain the influence on the attitude towards a partner that will determine in which way to interact in the future. And this could be done by, clearly it's a challenge. And so we could imagine that to go for, to deal with this challenge, we could imagine that is an enhancement of memory-related abilities, and the most obvious one are the enhanced episodic or semantic memory. But we must say that there's not an incredible amount of evidence for most group living animals to have this type of memories. And to deal with this social interaction memories, I, with some colleagues, put forward the idea that it could be an emotional mediation that would be, instead of having a very tricky bookkeeping of all the previous interaction, can be done with an emotional experience that is specific to single partners based on the previous interaction. If we take this stand, then what we need to have is that is a longer lasting emotional consequence. So there's still something related to memory, but what is needs to maintain is the emotional experience and emotional. So whatever has been done in the past will still emotionally affect an individual in the future, or even if there is a prolonged absence. And the alternative is completely different. It's actually that when you have a prolonged absence, you shorten the time frame of social change. So you don't actually interact as much. And the results from the PhD student of ours basically found that grooming reciprocity in spider monkeys seems actually following this type of pattern. The other possibility for cognitive complexity is an opportunity in which there is basically the individuals could say, okay, we can engineering the subgroup composition in terms of partner availability or own value relative to others. And this, let's imagine, okay, I'm a spider monkey and I want to really be very well protected. So I want to be in subgroups with all the big guys. And I'm going to try to engineer this type of subgroup, or I'm going to try to get into the subgroup anytime it's possible. But we could say that I'm the same spider monkeys, but actually, I want to be the big guy. I want that everybody else grooms me a lot and give me all sorts of services and so on, because I can be the protector. And so I can provide this protection, and then everybody else. So I'm going to find that I'm going in subgroup in which I'm the big guy. Okay, so this is a kind of extreme situation, but just to give you the idea that it's potentially possible, given the fission-fusion dynamics, that individuals will try to select to be in certain type of subgroups. And of course, if we think about more from a cognitive point of view, we can think about planning. Okay, there's very little evidence in general about animals other than humans do planning. There are some, and I think it would be interesting to do more research on that component. What I'm going to present you next, there's no doesn't have any evidence of planning per se, but results that goes along with the potential planning, but they can be easily done at an emotional experience level. So, and this is a study that we did a few years ago on our relationship quality affect fission decision, but I kind of interpret it based on this idea of the engineering planning much more recently. I don't believe that is actually in the discussion of this paper, this type of interpretation. So here we have the proportion of fission together, and we have the type of component of social relationship between two individuals. So two individuals, they are rather highly compatible with one another. They tend to fission together much more than if they are low compatible. Okay, this makes a lot of sense. The compatibility is basically a measure of relative tolerance. So individuals that they are fine to hang out together, and also probably is linked to the fact of doing similar activity. So this links back to the fissioning when you have with individuals that do the same activity of yolks. So the synchronization of the activity and so on. So this is not really particular big planning. It's basically kind of the outcome of what Hans Kummer was thinking about. You know, if you need to reduce subgroup size for particular reason, you go with this individual that are more compatible. The interesting thing are the other two components is that they makes a lot of sense, but I didn't really actually expect that they were coming out so nice. So the individuals tend to go much more with, they tend to avoid basically individual with high insecurity. They tend to fission less with the individual with high insecurity than individual with whom they have low insecurity. And insecurity here maps into risk of aggression. So clearly avoid potential aggressors. And the last component is the value. So if the individual have a cooperative relationship, they do a lot of nice things together, they help one another in conflict, they groom a lot one another. So then again, they tend to go in the same subgroup. So here, although there's no evidence for planning per se, all these results are in line of engineering subgroup composition, and the degree of cognition associated with that can be clearly variable. The last bit I want to mention is this, let's go back again to the idea that I'm interacting with Lauren, and then all of a sudden Eduardo comes. The social environment change of fusion, and what is the best things to do for me, possibly, is wait. Control of predominant response. I'm not continuing to interact with Lauren in the same way that I did, but actually I'm inhibiting. So an enhance of inhibition should be done because of fusion. I want to look around what is the new social environment, and then either I continue to do the same interaction or I do something else. So we did a study by looking at the behavioral flexibility and inhibitory control in 7 different primate species. The 3 on top are 3 monkey species, the 4 on the bottom, there are 4 apes, And so one possibility is that we find an easy difference in enhanced inhibition in a species that are more supposedly cognitive witty, so the apes versus the monkeys. But they have also marked this quadrants marked in green and yellow, identify the yellow, the one that have a high degree of fission-fusion dynamics, and the green, the low degree of fission-fusion dynamics. And we did several tests on the physical domain of inhibition standard test, and we ranked the performance. So here the orangutan was the best, rank 1, the chimpanzees number 2, and so on and so forth. We did for all of the 5 tests, and then we have a mean rank. And here you can see that the 5 with the yellow, they are all better than the 3 with the green, suggesting that fission-fusion dynamics play a role in this enhancement of inhibition. We follow up the same with another study, focusing now on social inhibition, and we find a similar support. Okay, in conclusion, the higher degree of fission-fusion dynamics is possibly linked to higher social complexity in certain domains. And I want to emphasize the certain domains, because one domain that clearly actually high degree of fission-fusion implies lower cognitive load, for instance, is the fact that there's so much information in potentially to keep track in a cohesive group. And when you have only a subgroup, there's much less going on. What the challenge is the missing information. But so that's why I want to emphasize certain domains. It's not that if a species that have a higher degree of fission-fusion dynamics need to have a higher complexity per se, and then higher cognitive ability or high communicative ability. No, it depends on which domain we are looking at. And we focus a lot about the experience by each group members, focus, and about the uncertainty, about interacting depending on variation in subgroup composition. So given these elements, yes, there is a higher social complexity linked to higher degree of fission-fusion dynamics. Then the next conclusion is that we talked a bit about cognitive complexity, and I gave the example of additional signals to resolve uncertainties and reestablish social intercourse after period of separation, the embraces. And we mentioned about something about cognitive complexity. There's much more to be done, especially on the enhanced memory abilities, in which we actually don't have data. I show you something related to potential planning and inhibition. And the last conclusion is about that I hope I convinced you that the higher degree of fission-fusion dynamics create challenges and opportunity for the animals. And then the question is, and what about the researchers? We started with the researchers having methodological problems. So I think there are challenges. Studying species with a high degree of fission-fusion dynamics is challenging, but we can come up with suitable methodology. I mentioned an example of the definition of subgroup, the definition of fission, the definition of fusion based on the definition of subgroup. But there are also opportunities. And I hope during my talk, I convince you there are many interesting study topics. And I hope that some of you will take some of these challenges and opportunities and study them in your own species. I'd like to thank all of you for the attention. And these are the various granting agencies that support our research.
Well, thank you, Filippo. That was an amazing talk. I really enjoyed it. I kept having questions. You kept answering them. So that was really fascinating. So this is an opportunity for people to ask questions of Filippo. Do you want to, not
stop sharing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you have a question, please post a question mark in the chat. If you're on YouTube, I'm watching YouTube, so please post your question there and I will relay it to the speaker. We'd love to hear from people both here and in YouTube today. As a reminder, when you ask your question, please identify yourself. We're trying to build this community, and so just state, your name, where you're from, and maybe if you tell us a bit about your interest. And then lastly, we really try to encourage students and postdocs to ask questions. So, some of the senior folks, if I see a question, I might jump ahead to that student, to get them engaged. So we'll start. We got a question from Eduardo, please.
Grazie, Filippo. A wonderful talk. Thank you so much. for joining us and for sharing. And I have no idea why. It was very towards the end that I just started thinking about this, and I will share with you. To what extent has this approach or this way of examining social interactions has been applied to children in a playground setting, in summer camp, in school? I'm just trying to think, I mean, so many times we look at non-human primates as a little bit of a simplified version of what humans can do. And I'm wondering if something like this could be accomplished through examining some of these issues with children instead of adults. Anybody, are you familiar with anybody looking at fission-fusion dynamics in children, in preschool age children, for example?
I'm not, but I think it's an interesting issue and topic. So I think we also, with any human settings, a little tricky about how important is the social relationship, because if you do experiments, you usually put a bunch of strangers together most of the time, so then that element is removed. With children, clearly I'm not, but then probably it'd be interesting to see the beginning of the summer camp, for instance, when there's a lot of people don't know much, and then towards the end it will be more. We did some study, and I know very much on especially colleagues that have done on my previous life question, the conflict management and so on, and there's a lot of similarities in what the children do to resolve their conflicts in the classroom, the play yard, and so on, with what we know in animals, human primates and other animals. In the natural conflict resolution book, we actually have chapters on children as well. And that's a lot of nice similarity. On this issue of fission-fusion, I'm not aware. I'm going to try, because one nice thing of the Google score is that you can actually see papers that cite the fission-fusion dynamics article, and then maybe we find something. So I'm not aware, but I'm going to do it. Doing this exercise with an article that is often miscited is fantastic. I found one that is basically cited for a Shakespeare interpretation and so on, and citing our fission-fusion dynamics paper. So hopefully we'll find something with children. But no, I think it'll be interesting to apply this idea of fission-fusion dynamics, but I'm not aware of a study, but maybe some of the other, somebody in the audience may know, and they'll be welcome to share it if they know it. But thank you for the question, Eduardo. Yeah.
Thanks for the answer, and I keep forgetting Eduardo Fernández Duque, Yale University in the US.
Okay, thanks for that, Eduardo. The next is Maren.
My name is Maren Hook. I'm from the University of Derby in the UK. Thanks for the talk, Filippo. And you talked a lot about the challenges and opportunities of the fission, and you talked about the challenges of the fusion. So what's about the opportunity? Why should they be in big groups at all? So what's the opportunity of being in the big groups?
Yeah, a very good question. You said, okay, why don't they're not always in small instead of forming subgroups, they're always in small groups. So the idea, because I think the data are not that strong, especially for spider monkeys, and maybe Tony Di Fiore or other experts on spider monkeys here that can help me out if I miss some elements. But the issue is that one thing that they need to do, and mostly is done by males, is defending their territory. So they're very, while the aggression within the group is very little, apart from certain moments like the fusion, they are very xenophobic. So they are not welcoming, especially males from the group. This is a species in which males stay in the group for the entire life, and the female leave puberty. So females are accepted more or less because other females are not very welcoming the females to begin with. So there's aggression between females that try to immigrate with the longer-term resident females. But I think the idea of being a large group is the defending the territory, basically. So that's basically, because again, one idea behind the living large groups is predation, but it seems that all the species that do this fission-fusion, they actually experience a low degree of operation. That's why they can do the fission. So, that is the main idea. But and certainly there is this how you call it antagonism. But most of the time, in spider monkeys especially, is shown with the vocal component or avoidance. But the males, especially, they go and patrol this boundary. And so I think the number of males probably is linked to the number of females. And so that's why we're getting these larger groups, although very rarely all together.
Okay. All right, so our next question is from Zulema.
Yes, Zulema Tang Martinez, University of Missouri, St. Louis. I'm retired, but my main interest before retirement was social behavior in mammals, particularly rodents. And I loved your talk, Filippo. I thought it was extremely interesting. I have one, I guess, observation. In the slide where you talked about the factors, or I guess, how we from the outside look at complexity versus how the animals on the inside look at complexity. And you used the bees as an example, and you talked about the various factors, including that the social insects have castes and have set rules. I think another really important factor, which was sort of implicit in most of your talk, but perhaps should be made even more explicit, is that in vertebrates, particularly mammals and birds that we know of for sure, there's individual recognition, so that individuals are capable of, recognizing others as individuals. While in the social insects, you do not have individual recognition, and you have instead generally group recognition with I think one or two possible exceptions where some wasps can recognize individuals by their face markings, individuals in the colony. But it struck me right away, and I've done work on individual recognition, that individual recognition would be a super important factor there also, in terms of the mammals, your monkeys, and other mammals and vertebrates recognizing others in their group, not just as group members, but as individuals.
Yeah, no, very good point. And as you say, it was implicit.
Yeah.
Clearly, it's implicit in the issue of individualized social relationship, because you can have an individualized relationship only if you recognize individuals. But I agree in this type of forum, I think we need to be much more explicit. So thank you, Mr. Lehmann, for pointing it out.
Yeah. But wonderful talk. Really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Kaya.
Great talk, Filippo. I'm Kaya Tombak. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Hunter College in CUNY in Jessica Rothman's lab. And I was just thinking about complexity in general, and whether it might be a little bit too vague to describe just really the trade-offs that different societies have to deal with. And so I can see it, fission-fusion societies being more complex socially in certain ways.
What do you say?
What's that?
What do you say?
Oh, I can see, I can see that, I can see how fission-fusion societies can be more complex.
What do you say? No, sorry. I just said, you keep saying fission-fusion societies. That's what I'm saying.
Oh, okay. Fission-fusion dynamics, sorry. But also I can see how stable groups could be more complex in different ways. And so just, from our own experiences, we have certain social circles in which they're more fission-fusion, and we just have, I guess we would have more superficial relationships with people that just kind of come in and out. But we have quite complex pairwise relationships with people that we have more of a relationship with. And so I wonder if just the types of complexity are different in those different dynamics.
I think I agree with you completely, and I think thank you for the question. I emphasized in the talk the kind of the aspects linked to social, high degree of fission-fusion dynamics, but those are on top on the kind of the complexity related to individualized social relationships. So they say they make that is usually the way that we are looking at. So these elements that are linked to the social structure. So social interaction, social relationship, how you interact with individual depending what kind of relationship you have with that individual, with kind of relationship you have with all the other individuals, how you maintain this relationship and so on and so forth. This on top of the fact that this relationship, they may be more transient, more or maybe less. So they don't, not necessarily they are less strong, because you make the example that the one that we do fission-fusion, they are less strong. Instead, I think at least in spider monkeys, this is not true. They can be very strong, but they're just not always together. So then they have the extra challenge of dealing with when they appear again, these individuals with whom you have a strong relationship, or actually you had a strong relationship. So is it still that strong feeling about both? Because we feel that we don't have, at least we may have the data we didn't analyze, that this spider monkey social relationship are rather transient. So they could be changing quite a bit how strong they are for time. They always have some strong relationship, but they may change over time compared to those species or primates that live, for instance, in this matrilineal system, in which basically the females in a single matrilineal maintain very strong relationship through life. So they are much more opportunistic. So they could be that if they became friends of somebody else during the absence, when you showed up, your best friends is not really treating you as your best friends anymore, because it's all more relative, the measure. So, but I agree with you. Even when you have fission-fusion dynamics, or at least, let's say, you could have a high degree of fission-fusion dynamics with individualized, a high degree of individual social relationship, or with low degree. So if you have an high degree, if you remember the graph with the 4 quadrants in which we have, there was some communication, but if you think about here there is a low individual low degree of individual relationships, and the other individualized relationship, the high degree. You can have both. They can be with the high degree of fission-fusion dynamics, and so depending on that, you could have that. Actually, it's not that important so much about dealing with the relationship, because the degree of relationship is not that high, but you still have to deal with meeting somebody and maybe saying, hey, we are fine, but actually you don't have any specific relationship with you. It's just to send a message that we are not going to fight now. While instead, if you have a individualized relationship, a high degree of fission-fusion, you need to deal also with the possible uncertainty, something have changed in the network of these relationships during the absence.
Yeah, I think you've actually done the best job that I can expect anyone that can, to basically parse that out. I just wonder whether, even if you have undifferentiated relationships, they can be superficial relative to relationships, for example, even if you have differentiated relationships, they can still be superficial, even just compared to like more stable differentiated relationships that would have more nuance. Like rather than, let's say, okay, I know that guy's dominant to me. That's just how we're going to, interact whenever we see each other. You might then, if in a more stable group, say they're dominant to me, but, I have my limits. And then like we kind of play around, and there's like a kind of maybe more room for nuance, right? I can't expect animal behaviorists to like go into all of that detail for every single pairwise relationship, but I just still see opportunity for trade-offs. But I think, with respect to like the full spectrum and like there being undifferentiated versus differentiated relationships, you have something there where, there's sort of more added layers of complexity that you can detect.
No, let's say I don't argue that they are more complex per se. That's why I think this is an element of complexity. I think you can make it completely. I think that you can have a cohesive group, which they have very complex social relationship that spider monkey may not have, let's say, and then it's higher complexity. I have no problem with that. It's more like when you get a certain degree of complexity for, let's say, the differentiation of social relationship, Then if you put on top of that, the fission-fusion dynamic, you may have other challenges. And so it could be more complexity because of this uncertainty. But I don't know, I think they are separate, they are interlinked, that depends on that. I think what you say, the nonsense and so on, I think it would be very interesting to study them. I think it's a challenge again, but I think it would be very nice to see if they have. For instance, in the species, I started to study spider monkey because I had data on macaques and chimpanzees, and I was feeling, while comparing them, I was comparing orange and apple because they have a social system so different. So I wanted to study a monkey species with a similar system of the chimpanzees. But one thing they have rather different is that while chimpanzees seems they have quite a clear dominance hierarchy, spider monkey don't. So the spider monkey seems that with the fusion that they do, they solve all the contests, and they have there's no. So we have with the males, we have an age-related things, that bit what I told you, and with the females, we have an immigration type of things, and then they are all kind of the same. There's no way to rank them, and there's no signal submission in any sort of things. The aggression is so rare, and then it can be in different direction depending on the context. So basically, we are not able. So in that respect, but then I don't think it's to do with necessarily fission-fusion, but it could be that if the majority of species live in fission-fusion with high degree of fission-fusion, deals with potential context competition in that way, then in a way it's easier the differential relation because you remove one component that is dominance completely. So in that respect, it could be less complex because you don't have that component. Thank you.
Okay, so we actually have a couple of questions from YouTube, so I'll ask those now. The first question comes from Kenna Lehmann. It's broken up in two parts, so it'll take me a second. Regarding the false dichotomy of cohesion versus fission-fusion societies, the question is, in species that are on the highest end of all three axes, is it accurate to say they live in fission-fusion society?
Okay, if people want to still use that terms, okay, you could do that if you want to. But then, of course, Hans Kummer will turn in his tongue because, of course, the Amadry's baboon and Gelada baboons, they are the species for whom he invented these terms, so clearly they are not. So, if we want to, let's say I personally think it is better not to use it because then you get into a career. But I think it's fine. If people want to use it, that those are the very the limits. Let's remember that we have in this nice graph, but we have almost no metrics. So when we talk about high and low, it's all based on the intuition. And so the only one, the measure that we come up is this one, the measure on the uncertainty that I showed with the paper of Gabriel Ramos-Fernández, that is only about one of those. The cohesion, I think we probably can do it. We need to have, we tried actually in the kind of a group of people that have been working on the original paper on 2008 and others, and we try to meet and come up with these measures and so on. We are still a work in progress. The major problem is that each of us have other priorities, so it's a slow process. But I think the answer is, if we want to use the terms, then I think, that probably those are the ones that need to be used to. But basically, there's really an handful, and then we need to have a measure really to be able to call it. So I prefer this high and low at the moment, in which there is this big gray area, and to try to do that. Once we have I think good metrics, then we can maybe put it, but then we have to be careful because there's a lot of old literature that call fission-fusion society the Amadry's and the Geladas that clearly will not fit.
Great. Okay, so our next comment comes from Phyllis Lee.
Oh, hi, Phyllis.
She says, fabulous talk as always. Can we call them multi-level societies rather than fission-fusion societies? And moving from primate visual proximate measures, can you suggest how we can add olfaction and communication?
Good. Phyllis is one of the co-authors of the 2008 paper, so she knows all the challenge on that. the first question is can you repeat the first question? A moment, sorry.
Sure, of course.
Missed it.
Can we call them multi-level
Yeah,
societies?
perfect. Yeah, multi-level societies. These terms is actually now the one that is used for anhydrous and geladas species. So that is so when you have the basis of single units. I didn't mention because it was open in another jar and was not really getting to that. They do fission-fusion dynamics, but they do in such a way they're called multi-level societies, in which you have different elements: the one male group, the clan, and the band, and then the overall troop. Okay, and so that's why they're called multi-level societies. They have elements that are the same of fission-fusion dynamics, and elements they are more this fixed priority. Now there's a couple of very nice review papers, one in 3 recently and so on this issue. So I welcome to everybody to read if you want to know more. The only thing on that is that I feel like it would be very nice to figure out other species. Though Mammophilus have a lot of experience with elephants, it would be nice to see if actually elephant could work in the same way, you know. But they are more flexible, so they tend to be. And Phyllis could correct me if she can. But with kind of a group that is based on the matriarch and their offspring and adult offspring and so on. But and several of these kind of groups form the larger group, with males are more in a separate groups or solitary. I think there's more flexibility than the anhydrous and the gelada. The other example I could think about, this is an interesting, because I think when it started, that was part of the review we did. There's so much variation. Imagine the parrots. Parrots have, the basic unit is the pair. And a lot of times the pairs are with many other pairs form a flock, and possibly several flocks. Then they can join sometime and make it this much bigger flocks. But the basic unit is always the pair. The pair is always together. But then there's a period of the year when there's no flocking. The pairs do nest, and each of them is separate, at least in some species. So it's an interesting dynamic. So there is a various way of getting to this multi-level. So, right, but I think the key is that they have to have some fixed units, like and then what is buying as well. They have a similar system, so they have a similar thing. But I agree, it's possible to use it. And so the second part of the question, yes, I think I mentioned the embrace, or a tactile type of a vocal communication. A tactile form of communication. Then we can imagine, vocal communication. That's even the definition of subgroup could change, because then you can reach individuals that are far away than the one they actually can see one another, and so maybe changing based on that. Olfaction is very interesting sense, because the information is there on the spot, but doesn't travel with individuals or how they. So I agree, there could be taking into account a lot more elements, and then I think, let's say for territoriality, for instance, the olfaction probably could be very important, even for species like the spider monkeys. They mark their territory with the pectoral gland, and they do this behavior on branching, and so they could actually mark. And we don't know if there is a signal for the other group or what, but it could be working in this direction. So, thanks, Phyllis.
Okay, the next question is from Luca Hahn.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, thank you very much for a very insightful and fascinating talk. My name is Luca Hahn. I'm a PhD student at the University of Exeter, and I study social behavior and jackdaws with Alex Thornton. So you mentioned that it's important to look at the individual and how individuals cope with that social complexity. And in that regard, I was wondering whether you might think that it's useful or even feasible to develop an integrated measure of social competence or skill in terms of how good individuals are at making these decisions. Because, so I'm curious about what the downstream consequences of individual decision making are, because then you might think about how the social skills evolve to cope with the fission-fusion dynamics. So do you think there might be a way to quantify that?
I think it's a very interesting insight. I think that will be good to get to, let's say, even although the issue that we are dealing with is a kind of a social, so kind of more than one individual issue, is focused on individual with the individual skills, the skills that the single individual have, and then kind of looking at individual variation probably to deal with different things depending on the skills they have. I think it's a very nice kind of approach, not one that I took so far, but I think it's a very insightful. I think there's room for doing something like this in and characterize, the different individuals on a specific kind of traits that they may have, or based on the experience they accumulate. And so they've been, let's say the very straightforward, simplified example of the new immigrant versus the longer resident, although that they may be as intelligent, they clearly they have different abilities because of the information they have of the group members. But by the time, over time, you could imagine then the individual, the new immigrants could acquire those skills and those abilities and so on. So there is skills and probably some information, because the skills probably are the individual has, but then also how these skills are gathering information and gathering to making those decisions. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting. Are you doing some moving your research in this direction?
Yes, I study the relationships in jackdaws, and I mean they also have a quite dynamic social system. So they also have these pair bonds, but then they also engage in these larger flocks, for example. So
exactly. Yeah, the corvids are another good example. I made the parrots, but it could be, and it also, I think, I don't know if it's the jackdaw, but I think the ravens have also this period of juvenility in which there are these large groups, and then they form the pairs. So it's again, and then they come together sometimes. So it's like a fission-fusion at the lifetime scale. They change in different things. Yes. So it's fascinating.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you very much. Really interesting.
Okay, next question is from Clara.
Thank you so much for the talk. Fascinating, and so many ideas for students to consider. I have an observation and then a question. The observation, which you may have alluded to, is that subgrouping would also reduce complexity. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, let's say being a subgroup, right, instead of the entire group. Yeah, yes. Exactly. That's what I meant to ask, but I did say at very late stage, so I think it's very good that you make this comment, because let's say if we're talking about information load, that basically the single individual need to keep track of all sorts of information, all sorts of social interaction that keep going in the group. Then, of course, being a smaller group, there's less information. So being a subgroup is probably there's less of this load than being always in a rather large cohesive group. I agree with you. The challenge is there that there's information going on in another, changes, social changes going on in another subgroup, which this individual doesn't have. And so when they get together, then the challenge is try to get this information back somehow to keep, to update the large group of information.
Thanks. My question pertains to ecology and your observation, great observation, that subdivision or fissioning would decrease competition for resources. Now, let's say that the resources are food. And let's say that on a certain day or at a certain time, the fruiting tree is super abundant. And at other times, the feeding trees are dispersed or ephemeral, etc. Do you think then that affects subgrouping or fissioning, so that when there's super abundant resources, there wouldn't be so much fissioning?
Yeah, exactly. That's basically what we find. So I didn't show those results. I show you the average subgroup size. for this condition. And so, yeah, when there's a lot of resources, this is not our, this is basically the typical study that had been done many other places. So this was not a new thing. It was the new thing was linking to the aggression level that nobody has actually checked. But there is a strong link, and at a different level. You could do it at the day level, you know, during the same day, if they change more when they experience. So they visit a small patch. What do they do next? They split because they were small, and so it's better to do it, or they do it the analysis at the overall the same day, or the month, the season. So overall, they find that there is a smaller subgroup size when there is fewer resources available.
Thanks so much. I just want to say, by way of introduction, I'm Clara B. Jones, retired, social evolution across taxa, but especially mammals. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Clara.
Okay, so the next question comes from Juan. Juan, you're here. Do you want to ask it, or would you like me to read it from the chat?
I bet since he wrote it, I think he wants to.
Yeah, okay, so I'll read it. So Juan is at Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. And he says, do you think that socioecological theory is up to date with regarding to fission-fusion dynamics? For example, the role of mateability or kinship during short-term dynamics on foraging size.
Okay. All right. I think there's more to do with socio-ecological theory. I think there was a lot of work, and then there's been a kind of a period of not much developing. I think we know much more, so I think it will be very interesting to do it. But also, I think we need to understand. A lot of the socio-ecology theory was focused on trying to kind of characterize the typical social relationship of different species, and usually the relationship between females. I think now we know much more about males, and also about the relation between male and female. So I think some of your example, the role of mate availability and kinship during short-term dynamics of, I think they are very important components that need to be added, because clearly and I think it's difficult to have an overall theory having all these details in it. So, but I think there's a room for developing elements of the socio-ecological theory with different components. So the one you mentioned about, especially with this temporary, so the short-term dynamics and so on, I think they are very important elements to put in, not so much to study. I'm always fascinated about, how those differences impact overall the patterns, because of course you expect that during short-term dynamics of foraging group size there will be a reduction of surplus size or whatever, so there will be a up. But what species that experience this on a regular basis, what is the implication on the overall structure compared to a species that may not experience it at all? So that's, I think, is more than the looking at what happens during this contest. These are examples, for instance, when this is going back in the past and looking at several species, they were very clear that they were experiencing contest competition or scramble competition, different degrees of contest competition. They were trying to do it experimentally, changing the regime of food availability. So instead of putting clump resource where you expect contest competition, you are giving dispersed food. And then, of course, during the moment that you do it, you see different patterns of aggression and so on. But that seems the interesting part was to study what those change in the short term, where if they're having an implication on the longer term or on the social relation of this individual outside this context. And that's, I think, is something that we need to consider. So if you have those data, one, I think it will be very important to maybe try to frame them in this context that you pointed out, because I think this could be pretty interesting to try to move forward in this direction. Thank you for the question. Gracias.
Certainly, Juan, if you have a follow-up question, please throw it in, type it in the chat, and I will forward that up to Filippo. The next question, right now, I think is the only one left, is Tony. Yeah.
No, that's Julia Fisher.
Oh, did I? No, Julia left. Julia left the.
Okay.
You had to leave, so.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, sorry.
Tony, go ahead, please.
I'll take over Julia's question. Tony D. Fiore, University of Texas at Austin. Filippo, thank you, as always, for a super interesting talk. Tons of stuff to think about, especially given that I've read all those papers. I have more things to think about again with respect to them. First thing, I just want to make a comment. I really appreciate your comment back to Juan's question on the importance of updating, revising, adding to the socioecological model. That's something that's, I think, quite important. I wanted to go back to this issue that you talked about engineering subgroup composition, which I think is a really fascinating one. And maybe the first place to start is to think about if you could unpack a little bit what you were doing, kind of the data that went into that slide that you had on planning, where you're looking at these three, I think, dimensions of dyad quality, right? Compatibility, value, and insecurity. And maybe you didn't really talk a lot about that, but how did you operationalize those?
Yeah.
And then I'm guessing that each of those bars then in the figure refers to averages among dyads. So different individuals are represented in multiple places in that. So maybe just a little bit about the operationalization of those metrics.
Yeah. Okay. So as I told you, the study was done for a different reason, but to see our quality of relationship. So this is done basically by entering different type, either straightforward social interactions, basically on rate of aggression, or some indexes. For instance, the variability of subgroup composition. Let's say subgroup composition every 2-3 months, and so the association index between two individuals, and we were trying to look at some variation. This was try to get into a measure of a kind of uncertainty. So that was much more stable, and I think was the coefficient of variation, the measure that we actually used for over 3 months period that we had. I think I remember correctly, 18 months, I think, of data. So all these various indices, they were entering in a principal component analysis, and they were getting 3 components, which we label compatibility value based on the behavior. So that part is the arbitrary part. The other part is not. It's done up to there is always element of arbitrary. We put some certain index and not others, of course, but we try to get a good representation of the type of behavior. For instance, we put embraces. For this particular one, the embraces was not going in any of the components. So the embrace is not in any of the 3, while in any other times that we actually use embrace for spider monkeys, we're always going in aggression. So embrace and aggression goes in the same component usually, and positively associated. So that's what we were doing. So then these 3 components were entered in a model to predict the fission decisions. And so the 3 components were all 3 in the same model. That's why I think that those percentage they are kind of bit odd in a way. So there is the same model with these are where the predictive variables of fission decisions. And so that we were looking. Now I don't remember. So I think anytime there was a subgroup, anytime there was a fission, we were looking at who's going to where. And so there was a proportion of the option that individual were going to the different thing, and we were characterizing each died with the PCA give you for 3 components. If I'm not sure if I come to more, Tony, or I did not answer your question.
So admittedly, you cut out a little bit there at the end.
Okay.
But I mean, this just means I should go and read the paper again. And
no. I should have answered, because I kind of know. I don't remember. I think a couple of little details, but basically it was done. The components are based on a principal component analysis.
But it looks like what you're then mapping is the proportion of times that a particular dyad goes together after a fission. So I'm guessing they're in the same group, there's a fission, and what's the proportion of time that dyad goes into the same subgroup post-fission, and then you're also characterizing those dyads, whether they are high or low compatible, high or low value, and high or low insecurity.
Exactly. Yeah, that is it. Yeah.
Thanks for the clarification. Just the other comment I wanted to maybe make about this idea about engineering subgroup composition, which I think is a really fascinating topic. It's a quite complex one too, right? Because anytime you try to engineer your own subgroup composition, you're potentially faced with other individuals' decisions about how to engineer in a completely different way, or reverse engineer, or subvert your decisions, right? And I'm reminded of the So
no, I agree completely. I mean, the example I gave was really stupid because they have this individual that can do whatever he wants. Of course, in reality, everybody's in principle is doing exactly the same thing. So what happens, I feel, in reality, is that you see some formation of subgroups, and you get your gut feeling is to go with one or the other, depending on what they look like. But of course, you going there may change the decision from the others, because they don't want to be with you. So there could be, sometimes you can actually see the fissioning taking place. Yeah. And then you can see that sometimes they call. So there's basically somebody who wants to be with somebody else, and they call, okay, why don't you come? And don't you come? And sometimes they abort the fission completely. They actually come back and they stay together because they didn't manage to get the individuals they want to be together or something. I mean, let's say, look like, I don't know precisely what happened, but it's not, sometimes that actually is a post, we realize that there've been a fission simply because now we are left with certain individuals that are not there anymore. So then we don't know precisely what happened. But sometimes you can actually see, the moving, or one stays and the other moving, and then you can see the process of these other individuals say, okay, shall I go with these other? They are already going. Look around and say, oh, I don't want to be with this guy. Let's better to go with the others.
All right, so I think we're going to end with one last question, and then you get a well-deserved break. This is another question from Eduardo. Please go ahead.
Yeah, not as much a question, but the kinds of things that we allow ourselves to do towards the end of our seminar. Fine seminar. We still have the YouTube community, but the few of us still here. And I invite those of you, if you happen to have video, please feel free to open up and have a little bit of a chat. I really appreciate it, Filippo. You started with the dichotomy that we worked on last week. We're full of those. And I also liked, as Kaya was commenting, that, I mean, the thoughtfulness, how thoroughly you've been trying to make progress in how we can best understand, describe these very interesting patterns you're describing. And it is precisely because of all the work you've done along those lines that I'm going to suggest if we shouldn't just stop talking about the sociological model. For one thing, at the very least, can stop using the word model and call it a theory, because nobody would have a title for a paper saying, does natural selection theory explain X? So it has become so broad, so poorly defined, so awfully poorly measured, that it's really, when you think about it, and this has to do with some of the literature we're seeing on the extent Valentin Ambring will be talking about this, what are really our hypotheses in the introductions? I mean, are we really laying out any evidence-based hypothesis to evaluate what we're calling the sociology of all mankind? I've done it, right? Very much like last week. I'm guilty as anyone else. But are we going to make better progress if we do with those things the same thing you're doing with describing relationships? I mean, there is no way to evaluate the sociological model, and it creates all kinds of confusions, not in a single study, not in a single system, not in 10, 20 years. So reactions to that. I don't know whether you were not in agreement or disagreement, but I want to hear either way.
No, let's say I grew up with the sociological model. I was incredibly glad to interact so much with Karl Schaik, that I think was a major engine in that development. And but I think there are limitations there. The more we know, the more limitations that we discover. And then Tony made an early comment, early papers describing some things, thinking they don't work, didn't work out. Others, I know Marina Horst has been always struggling to fit her species within the model, and they're not really fit. And so I agree with you that it could be good to avoid the word or models. But I think there are elements, like that's why I felt pretty confident to use a contest competition, scramble competition, because I was not trying to use them to put something in a box, but just to describe the phenomenon, what are the consequences of those. So those, I think, are important components of this overall sociological models as been taught. So I'm happy to talk about the theories instead of models. We try, I don't know if probably none of you read it, maybe some of you have been aware. Talking about this differentiated social relationship, I was invited to a very interesting workshop a few years ago in Göttingen by Oliver and Julia there, and we discussed a lot of things about social relationships, and then everybody was left by doing something. And then I ended up to work in a small group, and we came up with something that we actually ended up to publish by looking at how the sociological factors can affect in relationship differentiation. It's a rather complicated thing, but basically you flip the thing around, because there was not anymore they say a kind of component that is the contest competition, but was more like what the similarity of dealing with that by the individual point of view on the contest competition, another component that would have actually the same results. And if you want, I can show you. But basically, basically we were getting some more complex idea of the outcome, and then a lot of stuff that were not fitting in these boxes, of course. But it was more like using theory out there to try to come up with something that was more what we're focusing now. As I mentioned before, the sociological models theory were trying very much to classify the typical species ratio for a single the typical type of relationship for a single species. While in this thing we were looking at how this sociological factor could affect individual differentiation. So we're looking more at the variation, individual variation, or the degree of differentiation, because I think the variation is the key for experiencing social complexity. This was an idea that Julia Fischer developed a bit more in a paper earlier than ours, in which basically differentiation per se is not that critical, because if there's a high differentiation, all are highly differentiated, probably it's not that. But when you have a degree of differentiation that you need to deal with, that's probably is more you have the low differentiated, the high differentiated, stuff like that. I'm not, let's say, I may be getting confused because I see Tony is no, so I may get because. But I probably need to revisit the paper we wrote. But what I want to mention is that there are elements in this sociological theory that are still incredibly useful, and I think it's just that maybe they are not as useful as they used to be, or they thought to be, to explain what they wanted to explain, because now they actually explain much less because we know much more as well. So I think that's, but I feel like they're still important concepts that we can try to combine. But
no, I fully agree. So in reference to Tony's comment, so there's an element of semantics, which I think, I don't want to get there because I suspect we'll all agree. But there's an element of study design. Nobody would dream of saying, I'm going to study how the socioeconomic context, and replacing sociological for socioeconomic context. I'm going to study how the socioeconomic context influences risk of prostate cancer. Mm-hmm. Go get a grant for doing that. No, you're not going to get any money on topics that matter. Why? Because people will say, what do you mean by socioeconomic context, right? It's unmeasurable, it's undefinable. So now you were talking about effects, but you'll never be able to really get closer to identifying potential causal relationships between the socioeconomic context, because it doesn't exist. It's a reification of a number of variables, what you're saying. What I think that primatology has to get to, and we are seeing in all kinds of other systems that are easier to study because of all the things we know about primates, is that we have to I have no problem with us having the sociological model, call it model theory, call it whatever you want in the first paragraph of the introduction, if people need to know all these things that were agreed. But we cannot keep going back to even scramble competition. I mean, you simply cannot measure scramble competition in a wild population of primates with any reasonable hopes that you'll identify causality between X and Y, Y being some measure of reproductive fitness. So we need to break it down. And the problem is that we're not talking about how we're going to break it down, which is what you're doing for relationships. You are doing it for relationships. How we're going to break it down in pieces that we can handle, that we can measure reliably, that we can replicate, so that hopefully we'll be able to say, I have identified this tiny, tiny bit of the socioecological context that seems to be much better related to this tiny, tiny bit proxy of an outcome of evolutionary value. That's what I'm saying, that there's so much we can be doing. I think that's why it's related to the talk from last week, it's related to your opening, and it's related to the way you're approaching the description of relationships. I think you're doing it. I think you're doing it, your methods. What I think is that it may help us, not you because you're doing it, but I think we need more of that, of saying sociological model, blah, 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 and then tell me what the heck are you going to measure that is measurable, that is reliable and replicable. Because, sorry, we keep doing food availability and talking about patches, and it's like we don't move forward. We don't move forward. What is going to be that's what I'm just feeling yeah. But you're doing it with relationship. I think it's great. It's so complicated, but at least you describe it, you define it. I don't like it. I can go and change your definition and do it again.